Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday, this middle day of the week for our Coffee with PC check-in. I've got my, just a couple shots of espresso here with a little bit of milk mixed in. I don't know what you'd call that. I'm sure there's a name for it in the coffee stands locally. It escapes me right now, but I needed that little extra bit of a pick-me-up this morning. You know, some days, some weeks are like that. And so that is my case today. Got a full day ahead, but excited to spend just a few minutes with you today as we have been talking about the life of Jesus, some of the things he's taught, some of the things he did. We've looked at some really remarkable moments in his life, some well-known moments, whether it's feeding 5,000 or walking on water the last few weeks. Really incredibly strung together here in Matthew's account of his life. And now we turn to chapter 15 of Matthew, and we have an interesting thing here. Jesus is confronted, as would happen a lot in his life and ministry, by the Pharisees and religious leaders or teachers of the law. Listen to this one. Verse 1. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, "Why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat." Wow, big offense there, right? Now, certainly washing hands in the last 4 years or so has been to the top of most of our concerns. We've probably been told a lot how to, when to, how long to wash our hands. And even if we go back before that, we go back, to our parents sitting around the dinner table as kids. You got to wash your hands before you come to the dinner table. Something there that maybe these Pharisees are just concerned about germs, don't want dirty hands there. But actually that's not what's going on. In fact, right before they have this moment where they don't wash their hands, it's not about we don't want them to get sick. We don't want them to have dirt in their food. No, they break the tradition of the elders. That was the concern these Pharisees and teachers of the law had. Now, if you're not familiar with some of what that might mean, just a quick kind of background. And we know that what we call the Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible, and it is partly where God gives his law to the people of Israel. The first 5 books of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, we call the Torah the law of God. And it contains a lot of very important things that God instructed the people of Israel how to live, how to practice their faith. But interestingly enough, if you go through the law, you will not find a law that says wash your hands before you eat. Oh, you'll find things about washings, typically ceremonial washings. Leviticus, chapter 15 has a few reasons you would need to wash up, a few scenarios that you would want to wash your hands. And most of it was about ritual cleansing. It was about being clean and not being defiled. That was a huge part of all of the Old Testament law, clean and unclean, as it were. And so this is some of the reasons that washings were included, and they continued. But what happened is, in addition to the particulars of the Old Testament commands, or the law in the Torah or the Hebrew Bible commands, there was, as you see in verse 2, the tradition of the elders, or the tradition of the rabbis. There was this oral tradition. Some say it goes way back to Moses. In fact, if you read Exodus 34, that's an easy verse to remember, right? Exodus chapter 34, verse 34. It talks about Moses going into the tent of meeting with God, and then coming out and telling the people what he had learned. And so out of that idea came the fact that there was this huge amount of oral tradition in addition to the written Torah of the Hebrew Bible. And that's what's in mind here. Part of that oral tradition, this commentary by rabbis through the ages that was recorded in different ways, said you washed your hands. Actually, it was very particular how much water you used. It wasn't much. And how you did it, so that when you washed your hands, you had to raise your hands so it ran down across the wrist. If you had your hands down so the dirty water ran across your fingers, you weren't really clean. There was all this specific stuff about the way you washed your hands. If you were to read it, you would see it's not like what we would think of as washing your hands with soap and water for 20 seconds while you sing the ABC or Twinkle Twinkle song or whatever it was. That was kind of the common practice of a few years ago. It's not that. It's a more of a ritualistic thing. And so these Pharisees are going after Jesus because, as we saw, a lot of people were flocking to follow Jesus. 5,000 men plus women and children, 10, 15,000 people just in the last chapter that had come to follow him, that he had performed miracles, healings, and different things. He was a very popular, attractive figure. And so these religious leaders are thinking, how can we discredit him? Oh, I know. If we tell people he's not keeping tradition, they'll realize they shouldn't follow him. That was their plan. That's probably behind this, trying to pull people away from Jesus and back to them. And well, this is something that will continue and happen a lot. There's constant butting heads between the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and Jesus about different things. This is just one of them. But Jesus is incredibly wise. Being the Son of God, being God in the flesh, he knows exactly how things should be done. He knows more than anybody. And so he answers them in quite a remarkable way. He tells us in verse 11, he kind of turns the tables on him. In verse 11, he says, what goes into someone's mouth does not defile him. It's what comes out of the mouth that defiles them. Okay, now that's different. Jesus is saying, okay, you got a little dirt on your hands, and you're saying, oh, no, you're unclean. No, that's not really what makes a person dirty or unclean. It's what comes out. In fact, a few verses later, this is how he says it. He says, the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person. But that's pretty strong words, right? He's pushing back against these Pharisees who were very particular about the externals of the law, the rituals, the religious duties and practices. But he said, not just here, but many times, the problem was their hearts were not right. Elsewhere, a little later, he calls them whitewashed tombs. They're all pretty on the outside, but inside they're full of dead men's bones. He's saying, as was said in the Old Testament, while we look at the outward things, what we can see of somebody's behavior, we can see what they do or do not do, how good they are, how clean they are, how religious they are. God doesn't just look at that. He looks at the heart. He sees what's on the inside. And the only way we can sometimes judge what's on the inside is by what comes out of the mouth. Sometimes we see that in our own life, right? We get in a situation and things are difficult, and before you know it, we might begin to say things that normally, we wouldn't say. Or maybe you're building something and you hit your nail with a hammer and something might slip out. Now, I'm not saying every time you say a bad word, suddenly you're evil, but I'm saying we know that sometimes while we try to keep it together on the outside, we know sometimes on the inside that may or may not be true. And Jesus is saying God's looking at the inside. And that's really what defiles them. In fact, what Jesus would do in his life is he would go on and he would, a few chapters later, die on the cross and rise again. And he became the fulfillment of all of that Torah, that Hebrew Bible law, all of the sacrificial system, because he came to cleanse us from the inside out. The religious leaders were all about if you do the right things on the outside, God is happy with you, as if that's all he can see. But Jesus knew God sees the heart. And so he came and dealt with our heart problem. In fact, one of the things we're told is that when we place our faith in Jesus, we become a new creation. The old has passed away and the new has come. Or we're given a new heart. Sometimes we talk about in the way we talk about when people come to faith in Jesus. Why is that? That happens when we recognize that no matter how good we clean up, no matter how religious we act, ultimately, on the inside, when nobody's looking and when it's just us, maybe we do some things that aren't exactly righteous, that aren't exactly good. And we're invited by God to admit that to him. And in fact, when we admit that to him, when we come to God and say, you know what, I'm not clean on the inside, God. I admit I've got some behaviors and some motives and some thoughts that I'm embarrassed about, that are wrong, that are sinful, and I confess those to you. It's when we confess, when we admit that that's who we really are, that it paves the way for the forgiveness and grace of God to come into our life. That's the reason Jesus came, to show us by his perfection, by his perfect life, though he was tempted in every way as we are, yet never sinned, that we can have a good relationship with God, not by pretending with externals, but by being made a new creation from the inside out, by placing our faith in Jesus. That's what we try to do. We have that moment of salvation where we receive the forgiveness of God, having admitted and repented of our sins, and then we spend the rest of our lives trying to live out what that means and constantly struggling with our bad habits or our faults and slips, knowing that God stands ready to forgive us because of what Jesus did. The message of Jesus here sounds pretty harsh. It sounds like, oh, you have bad hearts, you have bad motives, you're evil, you're unclean. But in reality, it's, hey, when you recognize that about yourself, you're in the best position to receive the grace and forgiveness of God made possible through Jesus. See, we can pretend with our families, with our friends, out in public, but we can never pretend with God. He sees right to the core of where we are. And Jesus points that out in this interaction with these very externally religious people that on the inside weren't so hot. And so that's a reminder to us. That's the call of God to us. That's the grace of God extended to us, that in Jesus we can be forgiven, given a brand new heart, and the hope of eternity. That's why we get together as a church. That's why I put these videos out every week. That's why we have our Bible studies and activities. We want as many people to know as possible the grace and forgiveness of God. If you don't know that grace and forgiveness, we certainly would love to have you join us. We meet Sundays at 9 a.m. right here in Key Largo, mile marker 99. Come on down. Got plenty of seats for you. Love to be here as we talk about who God is and what he has done for us. Or, if you have any questions, maybe personally, or something you want us to pray for you about, you can respond to this video. I'll usually throw my email up attached to us. You can just drop me a quick note and say, hey, I want to know more about Jesus, or could you pray about this for me? And I would be happy to do that. Either way, it's our hope that you would come to know the grace and love and forgiveness of our good and gracious God. And that's why we're here, and that's what we're for. So come on down, join us. But beyond that, we'll leave it with you. I know I've got some things to do. I'm sure you've got some things to do this Wednesday. And so I hope you have a great day, a great rest of your week, and really would love to see you joining us on Sunday. So until then, take care.